Hello everyone, and welcome to the fourth in our series of creative conversations about suicide. My name is Tom Ayres. I'm the Director of the National Collaborating Centre for Mental Health at the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and I've been really pleased to be working with the Patient Safety Committee at the college and various people associated with that in this series of conversations where we're trying to get, I suppose, under the skin of key issues around suicide and suicide prevention through different types of conversations. Hopefully people will have the chance to watch all of them. Today's is about what is probably at the crux of working with suicidal people for clinicians or for anyone, which is about talking to people who are suicidal and talking to suicidal patients. And we hope to have a conversation which covers the full range of what that means, and maybe why that's difficult, or maybe why that how that can be helpful. Thinking about probably the technical skills, but also the kind of the humanity and the compassion and the experience for both the clinician and the patient of that conversation. I'm just going to we've got 4 people on the panel today, so I'm just going to go around one by one for them to ask them to introduce themselves quickly. So I will start with Mary, please.
Hello, everybody. I'm Mary, and I bring to this conversation my own experiences of wilderness years, of which suicidality was a hallmark, as was self-harm and involvement with mental health care services quite a bit, but also as a friend, mother, neighbour, and even in one instance, a stranger talking to someone who is thinking that life is impossible. So that's me.
Thank you, Mary. Sudipto?
Oh, good morning. I'm Sudipta Das. I'm a consultant psychiatrist in an inner city catchment area in Bournemouth, and I'm also the Deputy Medical Director for Mental Health Services in my trust. This is a very, very important topic for me, because this is something I do on a day-to-day basis in a clinical role, and we're having to assess and talk to individuals who often come to us in a crisis. So this is a very important aspect of our work, training, and going forward, ensure that it is done properly.
Thank you. I'll go on to Alice next, please.
Hello, I'm Alice Cole-King, and I'm a liaison psychiatrist, and I've had an interest in suicide, self-harm and suicide prevention since the early 90s. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally to Rachel.
Hi, I'm Dr. Rachel Gibbons. I'm a consultant psychiatrist and psychoanalyst and the chair of the Patient Safety Group at the college and the new working group on the effect of suicide and homicide on psychiatrists. And I've been working on suicide over the last 12 years, since in the first 3 weeks of my consultant career, I had the deaths of 2 patients by suicide and was traumatized by that. So I'm working with my trauma, if you like, over the last 12 years working on suicide. So very pleased to be here.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you particularly to Rachel, who's been the sort of driving force in bringing these conversations together, which we hope are of benefit and offer something different perhaps to other materials that people can watch. I'm going to start the conversation, which will be for about an hour or so, with a question. The question contains an assumption. People may want to challenge the assumption. So the assumption is that talking to someone who's suicidal is difficult. So I think I'm going to start with Mary, if that's okay, to ask this question. So Mary, can we start by just exploring that? And if I could ask you what you think makes talking to suicidal people difficult?
Well, I think, Tom, that perhaps talking well to people who are suicidal is difficult. Talking in the most effective and most compassionate way is difficult. And it's also probably frightening. And maybe we'll come on to that a bit later for lots of different reasons. And my experiences of these sorts of conversations are both being on the receiving end of them and in a sense knowing that the clinician who was with me was to an extent treading on eggshells, worried that if they said the wrong thing, they might upset me or make me angry or make me more likely to do something irreparably damaging to myself. And I've also seen them cling to the comfort of a sort of formula or list to make it feel safer from their perspective, that they have covered everything that they feel they should cover. I think from the perspective of an ordinary non-trained person having those sorts of conversations, although I think they are difficult to have, it is certainly better to have them than to not have them. And my experience of asking people if they are thinking of ending their own lives, when I have done that as in a lay capacity, has always been the enormous relief that people have, that somehow they can share what to them often feels like the most shameful thought or action, the profound shame that goes with that. Does this make me a bad mother? Mary, my best friend, said to me, who did indeed go on to die, but the conversation with her was one where the relief of being able to be straightforward about despair and the impossibility of life was about the only thing I could offer her. So I think if talking about suicide is difficult, or talking well about it is difficult, and not talking about it might seem easier, from the perspective of doing the best you can, talking about it seems to me the only real humane and kind and therapeutic option. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, and thank you for sharing that perspective, Mary. Maybe Alice, do you want to come in and with your kind of thoughts on this?
Yes, I think we have to be open and honest about the barriers and the challenges. Absolutely. And, you know, tragically, when somebody dies by suicide, the impacts for those left behind, for many of them, are lifelong. But thankfully, suicide is still relatively rare. But suicidal thoughts are actually far more common than we admit. And, you know, a lot of the research tells us that maybe, I don't know, 1 in 10 people at some point in their life have experienced suicidal thoughts. But actually, it's probably far more. But for all the reasons that Mary mentioned, we just don't talk about it. So there's often huge shame, embarrassment, fear. And certainly as clinicians, yes, of course, we might, you know, have a technical conversation with our patient and hopefully a collaborative, compassionate mental state examination. But at the end of the day, genuinely, we are reliant on what our patients feel able to disclose to us or not. So I think there are lots of challenges, and I don't think there's enough honesty about the emotional burden. Because if you're a clinician who cares, actually there's a huge emotional burden behind all of this that we're barely starting to acknowledge. So again, you know, I know that we're all so happy to be taking part in this conversation because we need to have more honesty and openness, because then we can move forwards.
Thank you. Rachel.
I was just wanting to link to Alice's point that she's brought forward, because I do think it is difficult. I don't think, as a human being, you know, to approach someone else with an open heart who is truly suicidal is difficult. It's painful. And if you approach someone in a way where you're wanting to help them, getting close to them emotionally, you'll feel some of the pain. You know, there's no getting away from that. And you have to be open to do that. And that is difficult. It's painful. There's something about this, the word. I mean, I think there's something about this conversation being very important, because there's something about the word suicide and being able to say it that somehow contains so much within the conversation that actually it's very hard to take apart, but somehow it seems to get to the nexus, the umbilicus of someone's distress. And so you have to be emotionally in a place to be prepared to receive some of that and to feel it and to empathize with it. And there's lots of very human reasons for not wanting to do that, you know, or wanting to back off from that. Also, I think people can be very concerned about where they go from there. So once you're talking to someone in the heart of their distress, or talking to someone in that way, well, what do you do then? And even the most experienced professional people, well-trained people, can still feel fearful about opening up, getting close to somebody, and not knowing what to do with emotional distress as well. And then if we put on top of that also cultures that might, I think in society, but in the NHS, I think particularly about cultures of blame and persecution, then that also is another barrier, isn't it? So do I really want to put myself in a risk situation myself by going to talk to somebody if I might be blamed if they do something? And I think we've got to be honest about that pressure as well. So I think it is difficult, and it's important to be honest about that, yet it is the heart of what we do. I don't think we can be a psychiatrist unless we are prepared to take on the distress and the difficulty and this challenge.
I'd agree there, because I think one of the key things which comes loud and clear is when somebody opens their heart, tells their psychiatrist or mental health professional how they're feeling, but then either not believed, or in somehow they feel their distress is minimized, or perhaps even worse, not validated. You know, it can, in theory, make someone feel worse.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So I just wanted to add something what Rachel mentioned and Mary and Alice mentioned. Absolutely right. It is a conversation we all feel apprehensive about, but it is something we do day in, day out. You know, especially in the way the services are organized today. It's kind of only the severe patients, individuals come to see us. That said, we have to get it right, because if we don't, you can always end up damaging the therapeutic relationship. Adding in further to what Rachel was saying of the impact of suicides on you know, we know the impact on individuals, on family, etc. But I think there is also something I always talk about is a second victim, which is the clinician involved, you know, and the impact it has on them. It's almost like I remember myself, and you know, you're always looking over your shoulder and thinking, when is it going to happen next? And of course, then there's the other issue of you know, kind of the blame culture taking over, or having to go to corners court and give evidence, and how will that impact on my assessment on what I have done, etc. So I think talking to individuals who are suicidal has got so many facets to it. You know, whether it's how we talk about it, what we ask, how we do it, the compassion, the empathy that's got to be there. Then of course, what do we do once we have got all the knowledge and all the information? And last but not the least, what happens to me or the clinician who's assessing should something go wrong? You know, I attend our Trust SI panels regularly, and it's a conversation that time and again try to say that it's not about blame culture. It's not about finding faults. It's about learning, you know. But it's getting that balance right, isn't it? You've got to be a clinician, got to get your information, come to a conclusion, diagnosis, treatment, etc. But also to be mindful of the impact of it all on the individual. Most importantly, the person we are talking to, but also the clinician.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think a couple of, possibly all of you have talked about fear being part of, or there being some element of fear in the conversation, whether that's fear of getting it wrong or fear of the consequences if something goes wrong, you know, consequences in the broadest sense, I suppose. How much do you think, how big a part do you think fear plays in making it difficult to talk to someone? Mary, I'll go with you again.
Tom, I don't know, it follows exactly from the question you asked, but I think the perspective to bring to what we've said thus far about the professional perspective, and Alice touched on it, is that from the point of view of a person, particularly people who carry, for what it's worth, the diagnostic label of personality disorder, as indeed do I, there is a sort of profound fear that the suggestion might be made that you are not being truthful, that you're manipulating, that you're playing games, and you know, phrases that have been said to me and said to many other people. One of my sons was told in A&E, "What's a clever boy like you doing a stupid thing like this for? You should know better." Those sorts of comments make us frightened about being honest about how we're feeling. In the chaos and muddle of it, whatever people do, I think there are very few people in deep distress who are manipulative. They may not make sense to themselves or anybody else, but I think one of the fears is of being judged and trivialized and othered, I suppose, by the profession who might help you. So I think that is part of fear from the person seeking help's perspective.
Alice?
Yeah, absolutely, Mary. And I'm horrified that that happened. You know, I'm sure that goes without saying. I know we would all be, and I'm so sorry, but the reality is we know that still happens. And certainly in the early stages of my career, I didn't know what I know now about suicide, about the experience. And certainly in the early days, I didn't know enough about the ambivalence. You know, somebody can both want to die because the pain is too much, but still want to live, but without the pain. And I think that, you know, it's almost like some of the fear, perhaps of certainly of trainees, is that still in many places, it can be the most junior people who have these conversations, who are not always as supported as they may wish that we would want them to be. So I think there is something about understanding why it's fearful. Also, we have to be honest about sometimes the lack of resources. You know, that the college itself is calling for more investment in mental health services. And I think sometimes the fear is, well, if I identify with how distressed and how in danger this person is now, I know I don't have a bed available, I don't have home treatment capacity. So I think we have to be honest about that it's almost like a false fear that people are scared to identify because they feel they don't have the resources, never mind the skills, just the resources to deal appropriately with that person.
Yeah. Sudipto?
Yes, I completely agree with what Alice and Mary have said. You know, the number of times I've had individuals I've seen in clinics or in ED, and you know, once we've had the conversation, once they have in a better place, when we revisit the conversation, they will often say it was such a difficult experience and such a frightening experience, not knowing what I was going to get into, you know, whether they would be detaining me against my will and taking me to hospital. All those kind of things plays into the individual's fears. And I'm sure that's what makes it even more difficult for the individual seeking help. From the clinician perspective, Alice is absolutely right. You know, often you get the feedback from trainees or from colleagues, non-medical colleagues who have seen the patient, seen the individual, and they will say that it was such an anxiety-provoking situation. What if I get it wrong? What if I don't get the right information? All those things play into your mind. And then again, let's not forget what I said earlier on. It's about the fear of being blamed. You know, like if I've got it wrong, will I be will I be the person who's made the wrong call, and will I be called to taken to task? So keeping all that in mind, it does the whole emotional aspects of talking to an individual with suicidal thoughts, plans, or intention is quite anxiety provoking, if not frightening. But and that's something, again, we as senior clinicians, that's what we have to do, is try to provide them the support, provide them the supervision, and to my patients, you know, talk to them in a very compassionate, empathic manner, and be honest about it all.
I was just going to come in, Tom. I mean, I was thinking that I think this is such an important question in this, because I think there's fear from so many different directions that you can sit in any part of the whole, you know, dynamic around this conversation, and there could be fear in each part. And what I was thinking about is the fear of the person who is in a suicidal state themselves, who is in that place. I think they're terribly frightened that they're falling apart. You know, there couldn't be a more frightening state than one where actually I think ending my life might be a better solution to where I am at this moment in time. I just can't bear it anymore. I'm falling apart, I'm fragmenting. So there really is, again, at the really heart of it, a terrific fear that's in the heart of it. And then everything, I think, reflects that around it. I think from the clinician's perspective, I've definitely heard very senior people saying, I didn't want to talk about suicide because I thought talking about it and saying the word would mean that they would be more likely to act on it. So there's something about that sort of almost primitive state of mind where you get into a very concrete belief is that I can't even mention this, and I've seen this in a PQ unit before. We don't talk about suicide here in case it puts the idea into the patient's head. So it becomes very fearful in that way. And I think that maybe comes to something we might talk about a bit later on to do with responsibility. I think the boundaries around responsibility in this conversation are very important to think about. That if I talk to this person who is acutely suicidal, somehow I've got to take responsibility for what they do. And I'm going to, by talking to them, I'm going to become responsible for their actions. Which if that's the case, then that's a very frightening place to be.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm thinking about, well, it feels like to think about it as this kind of huge thing about taking on someone else the responsibility for some, what might happen if I have this conversation. It feels so overwhelming, doesn't it? And I wonder if a way that's is helpful to think about how you would do that is to start to think about, if we move on, maybe to think about what are we trying to achieve in a conversation when we speak to someone. What are we trying to achieve? So we start what we're trying to do rather than what we're scared might happen. And so I've had conversations with suicide people who I didn't know on thinking of one in particular on a train, and I remember that conversation being it was anxiety provoking, but I remember thinking at the start that I wanted to make sure what I wanted to achieve was to make sure this person stayed alive in the immediate future. But then as I got into the conversation, I could feel myself starting to want to help to mend the things in their life that were wrong, and that obviously becomes completely unrealistic expectation from the conversation. But it kind of makes me think about this question about what are we trying to achieve is a really can be a really big question, and it might help to break it down, hopefully. Perhaps, I don't know, Alice, could I start with you on this question?
Well, I think I would be hoping to achieve 3 things. The first is to be able to really connect with that person so they feel able to disclose exactly how they're feeling to me, literally tell me everything they need to tell me. The next step is to do what I can in that moment to maybe help them deal with their distress, or to almost just start to uncover some hope. Because so often we see people who, are at the end of the line and they have literally feel they have no hope. So it's almost like that therapeutic part of the assessment. But ultimately, what I really want is to understand how they're feeling, what's going on in their life, to very diligently take as much information as I can to identify all risk factors, everybody to do with this person, just so that together, collaboratively, we can find a way forward, so that it may be things that the patient does, it may be things that myself as a clinician or other clinicians do, but it's almost like you need so much from this interaction, but ultimately it's to try and help them actually not want to die today, to try and help them not want to die this week. And then I suppose that buys time for practical things or therapeutic things or medication or whatever is needed. We have to think in a very holistic way what is needed to help this person actually no longer want to die, that actually they feel that they can face life.
Thank you. I wonder, Rachel, if I go to you next, please.
Well, I was thinking, Tom, about what you said, which was I wanted to help them stay alive. That was your primary, or that's what it sounded like. And I was finding myself thinking and struggling with, it's not quite a conflict, but 2 parts, saying, is that the main issue? Because I wonder if something in psychiatry, we can get so focused in trying, we've got to stop someone dying, where there may be what there is an opportunity for is when someone expresses suicidality to actually have a therapeutic engagement. There's a therapeutic interaction possible. So that therapeutic interaction might have different outcomes. To try and say, well, I'm going to hold you and stop this happening, you know, might in a way impede the therapeutic, more developmental contact. Because I suppose what I was thinking is that from my perspective, thinking about it, that suicide is an acting out event. So people act out when they can't put something into words. If you can therapeutically engage with someone, their distress, the word suicidal can be translated into much more complex expression of emotions and, you know, symbolizing that becomes less concrete. If you can put it into words, you're much less likely to act. So I would say that that would be sort of the aim for a therapeutic developmental contact that relieves something. And I would really have a large part of myself really longing, I suppose, for them not to harm themselves. But I don't think I can totally locate myself in that wish.
It's really interesting. Sudipto, perhaps.
Thanks, Tom. Absolutely right, what Alice and Rachel said. So I'm really just going to be adding to that. I mean, from my perspective, I think I always look at it from two angles. So there's the human element of me, you know, and that is to be there, to be listening, to be understanding, to get the story from them, to share to understand the experience and then share what we can do to help them. But from as a clinician, the most important thing for me is to understand why is it that the individual are doing that, what they have done, or thinking of doing what they have done. Am I missing something more sinister and serious that might require treatment? For example, is there a psychotic disorder because of which they're hearing auditory hallucinations, you know, command hallucinations? I want to be sure I'm not missing all that. So then I can at least facilitate the right kind of treatment or approach to support them and come up with a safety plan. So once I've got those two hats on, I'm thinking, you know, in that context, then my next aim is to try and understand what is it that drives them and how it is, and get their take on what is it that they can do to keep themselves safe, or what can I do to help them get their involvement in that process, you know. And last but not the least is, again, as I said, as a clinician, I'll be thinking, is there a mental disorder? And if there is one, what is the right treatment for it, whether it's biological, psychological, social, or whatever it is, and involve the individual in making that the safety plan, the treatment plan, and try to go through with it, you know, try to help them through the process. Because even when they come out of the crisis, even when they are in a better place, they still feel the ramifications of the incident, you know, and then having to help them through that too is as important as being there in the first place in the crisis situation.
Thank you. I'm really interested in your perspective on it as well, Mary.
Thank you, Tom. I've got just a lot of quite swirling, complex thoughts, which I don't know I'm going to articulate very well or in the right sequence. I think one of the things that I would want to say is about time and the reality of an interaction in a very pressed clinical environment being time limited. And it seems to me the most helpful thing people can do is be alongside someone in the sort of shitty, crappy place they're in, at least for a bit. And when you're a very heavily time-pressured clinician with other people to see, that's tremendously difficult to do because time is not on your side here. But a way of making sense of time, I think, is what you can perhaps constructively do. I wonder if I'm unlike many people who have said again and again, I can't bear living, or I wish I was dead, or I have nothing to live for. Actually, not really thinking that, but thinking much more about a magic solution in which I might be like the Snow Princess, put to sleep for 100 years to wake up and it'll all be better. So actually, I think wanting to die was not necessarily really a truthful description of what I wanted. And then someone saying, I will get you through the next breath or the next footstep or the next half an hour, to take very short increments of time and help someone to make sense of how they could get through those short aliquots of time may be helpful. And then the last most powerful thing in my experience that happens, regardless of how these conversations play out, is when I can see that my life matters to the person who's talking to me, even when I don't believe it has any worth at all in my own eyes, or perhaps even the eyes of society. And evidencing to someone that they matter might mean you haven't got long to spend with them today, but it might mean you can make sure that someone checks up with them tomorrow, or checks up with them in a few hours' time, or takes notice of their distress, or gives it some significance and invests in it. And I think that perhaps brings on another challenge, which may not be relevant to raise, but I find myself thinking all of the time how odd it is that individual caring people feel that they might be able, with all sorts of resource constraints, to save someone's life in the way you were talking about on the train, Tom, where actually everybody knows that the failings in investment, in infrastructure, in provision are huge. And most people, if I wanted to go to sleep, if somebody had said to me, we have this refuge, Mary, where you can go and not see anyone, you can be there for a week, and we'll keep in touch with you there, it might have been very different. But the only options available to me seemed to be detention or terrifying freedom, and not much in between.
Thank you for that, Mary. So pick up a couple of things that people have said about the opportunity for a therapeutic intervention in the conversation. And Mary, you talked about feeling that someone cares. I suppose that as being, as a person having that conversation, what, if you'd have thought about it, what you wanted to achieve or what was useful to achieve was the feeling that somebody cared. So having that, I guess, a genuine and therapeutic connection as well as a conversation. Be good to think about what the key elements are of how you of having that kind of genuine and therapeutic conversation with someone in this circumstance, or someone who's suicidal. Perhaps Rachel.
I start off then. I mean, I think I think there are different aspects of it up to this, because I'm going to move into thinking about it from a clinician's perspective. With the best will in the world, I can want all sorts of things, but if I'm not in an environment where I'm supported and contained for this to meet someone and have this therapeutic conversation, then it's going to make it incredibly difficult for me. So if I'm in a busy A&E department and I'm very, very stressed, I haven't got the physical containment and space, but I also won't have the internal containment and space. Because there's something about genuinely conveying that you care, which in my experience, nearly all the clinicians I've ever worked with are in the job because they do care. But there's something about the circumstances that can push that compassion and capacity to care momentarily out of you. So then it can be very difficult, depending on the environment you're in. So there's something about the environment and trying to work and contribute to environments where you can have this sort of therapeutic space. I think there's also something about openness and honesty, trying to be as open, honest and truthful as you can, which I think probably does matter. And when someone is feeling particularly vulnerable, I think they're very sensitive to whether the communication is straightforward and they can sort of feel it, whether it's sort of heart-to-heart communication. So I think there's that very important aspect of that conversation. How do you genuinely convey to someone, look, I really do care. I do care about your pain and distress. Very important.
Sudipto, maybe next.
Thanks, Tom. Oh gosh, I'm trying to think what else I can add to what Rachel said. I mean, the important thing for me, and this is something I keep telling my trainees time and again, is not to go with preconceived ideas. The individual might have been there a week before, a couple of days before. Doesn't mean that we kind of have a preconceived idea of this is what they are suffering from, or this is what they are there for, but go in for an assessment or a review as a fresh review, as a fresh pair of eyes, going over it, understanding what the problems are, not just going by what is said in the notes or what somebody else might have told you, when they have called you for the assessment, so that I think is so important in our mindset to be clear that I'm going there without any preconceived ideas. And absolutely right, and the ability to mindful of all the restrictions and the constraints we have, to be able to do that in a compassionate, open, honest manner, and explain to the individual what I am doing, why I'm doing what I'm doing, and why I'm asking the questions, is I think will help me with that in the therapeutic alliance, in the conversation. And last but not the least, but also when I finish when I conclude my assessment, what it is that I've gathered all the information is trying to, explain it back to the individual and say, look, you've been really helpful. You've given me all this information, the deepest, darkest thoughts, and thank you very much. But in my impression, this is what it is. And what do you think? Having that conversation, what is the outcome of the assessment and what we could do to help you and help the individual feel safe. I think that's what I would think are the key elements in the when talking to someone with suicidal thoughts or plans.
I was finding Tom, can I just come in quickly? Because I was finding myself also feeling, are we missing something, some aspect of this discussion, which is to do with the complexity of expressed suicidal thoughts. They can mean very different things. They can mean I am really trying to communicate about my distress, or I am very distressed. But they can also, we've got to be that in some cases, they can be a way of trying to control or communicate some other things that are less straightforward. And I think it's important for us to also consider that. Otherwise, we're simplifying the complexity of the clinical situation, I think. So I think there's something about needing to broaden out what it means when someone's talking about their suicidal thoughts. Sometimes it's not as straightforward as we're talking about it now. The other thing I was just wanting to come back to Mary to just link with was that what Mary was saying was actually, when I was saying I was suicidal, it wasn't really that I wanted to die. And I was linking that with the theoretical ideas by Don Campbell and Rob Hale, talking about suicidal fantasies, which is when someone, even if someone is really acutely suicidal, really straightforwardly acutely suicidal, they're not really wanting to die. They're not really thinking that they're going to die. There is some picture that they have in their mind, often of some sort of escape from pain. I was thinking about going to sleep for sort of 24 hours, or, that there's a picture, if I could just go to sleep, if I could just for a while, I'd feel better. So there's something about, even in the people who are the most determined, if you like, in their suicidality, that they're not really wanting to die. And if there's a possibility to connect with the part that is engaged with wanting to live, or being able to be curious and interested about what's going on in someone's mind, then I think that also allows for a much wider therapeutic discussion and experience, opens something up.
I think there's two important points I'd like to add to everyone else's. And I think, firstly, the more we understand about compassion, the more we understand about the barriers and facilitators, the more we can maximize what ultimately is probably a far too short time per person than we would want. So I think, first of all, you have to be absolutely honest. But if you can, in the first part of the consultation, do nothing but focus on compassionately connecting with that person. But then if you explain, in order to best understand them and together make a plan for a way forwards, I'm very sorry, but I do have a number of important questions that I really need to ask you in order for me to really understand how you're feeling. And I think if at the beginning you just accept everything you're told, because that is how somebody is feeling, you don't try and argue back, you don't try and trick them that they're not really suicidal. And anybody who does that is probably just because they're terrified because they don't know what they're going to do next. If you almost listen to that person's reasons for dying, you are then given the chance to have a more sophisticated, more nuanced decision, more nuanced conversation about everything that's going on. Because as Rachel mentioned, sometimes people say they want to die because the pain of living is so much, or maybe their ability to think of potential solutions is narrowed, either because of their distress, or it may be that they have a mental illness, not necessarily, that they're unable to think of potential solutions. So I think if we just stop arguing with our patients for the first one, even if it's unconscious arguing now, I don't think people literally argue. And I think that the more we understand, but the other thing, if we look at the more detailed understanding of compassion, there are various attributes and various competencies, and this is the work by Professor Gilbert and colleagues. But one of the key elements of compassion is actually distress tolerance. And it's actually really hard to be with somebody with that raw emotional pain. And in a short period of time, there is so much that we have to get through in the assessment that you still have to ask some of the technical questions, because it may be there are lots of different reasons why somebody is experiencing suicidal thoughts. But the compassion is the first bit to almost get alongside that person. And the whole thing is, as Mary said, it's unrealistic to think in a few moments you're going to change somebody's mind. It's totally invalidating that you think you can give somebody reasons for living when they've just told you they don't have any. But maybe what you can do is help people break up time into manageable chunks. And it may be that somebody can consider living for the next few minutes, and actually equipping them to know how to deal with that pain. And obviously then you start to build a degree of self-efficacy. And I think the whole thing, but obviously you have to be guided by your patient and go at the speed that you have to be very, very sort of focused and attentive in this conversation. And sometimes for part of it, you have to literally, I think, be listening, not constantly jotting notes. Obviously, note keeping is really important, but there are times when the conversation is as important, if not more important, in that moment than writing everything down. Obviously, both occur, but we have to be very sensitive about what happens when.
Feels really helpful, Mary.
Tom, I just wanted to pick up on what seems like a very small point, but something Sudipto said, which I felt really emotional to hear him say, which is start with a clean slate. So many of my conversations have begun, we don't need to go over all that old ground, Mary, we've read your notes. And actually, the Mary they are seeing is not the Mary who was there 3 days ago, 5 days ago, a week ago, a year ago. And so I think if somebody starts by saying, we don't need to go over all that old stuff, I've read your notes, I know that what matters to them most is getting through this process fairly quickly. And it just seems not to create an authentic foundation for where we can begin, they to understand me and me to understand them a little.
That's really helpful, Mary. And thinking about how you can start this conversation is, I think, the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which you've taken us to. I'm also interested, I've been thinking throughout the conversation as well about the setting and where these conversations are taking place and where I've witnessed them taking place in busy A&E departments, for example, or in other places. Structure is not always ideal. So I think it's probably worth acknowledging that the setting sometimes is not in the control of any of the people involved in the conversation, but do affect how you start the conversation, how you have the conversation as well. So I just wanted to kind of have that in our minds as we talk about then how is the best way to start a conversation like this. And I wonder if I can start with Sudipto for this bit, please.
That's a very, very important question, is how do we start the conversation? And you made the point about setting. Let's not forget we are in COVID times, so a lot of assessments are being done remotely. So it's, the setting has changed completely from what it was this time last year, or perhaps even a year and a half ago, you know. So we have to factor that in mind. The setting is really, really important, whether it's you're in the ED or in your clinic room or on the ward. You know, you have to have the right place where the individual feels reassured, feels safe to talk about their deepest, darkest issues, you know. And then again, once we've got the setting right, it's a point that Alice made, you know, the other softer things. Am I being attentive enough, or am I busy making notes and inputting stuff on my laptop, on my computer, you know, completing the documentation as I go along? I mean, those things are really, really important, because that can make or break the therapeutic alliance, you know. And then, of course, what and how do you start the conversation? And with the individual, you know, and something I do personally is always be honest and say, look, this is why I'm here. This is why I've been asked to come and see you, you know, and please, let's have a conversation. And you tell me what, and I keep it open-ended, and keep it more as a listening experience, rather than you know, very directed. I've got to go through this tool of 10 questions, and this is what I'll be going through. And you know, if you digress from it, I'm sorry, I'm going to bring you back to it. So it's a skill. It's something that we develop over years, but it is so important that we get it right, because without that, the alliance, you know, you just start off in the wrong foot, and you might just end up putting the individual more at distress than anything else. You might not solve the problem.
I was finding myself thinking about the different types of situation, because I suppose I was thinking, as a psychiatrist, I could be asked to see someone who I already know is acutely suicidal. That's why I've been asked to see them, which is one type of conversation, one type of communication. Then there's different situations where there are patients who suicidal thoughts are actually very common. You know, they're common within the mental health population, but they're very common in the population that hasn't got identified mental health problems. Suicidal thoughts are part of being a human. And I think we, you know, if we're honest with ourselves, we've probably all had them at some time or other. So there's something about the different types of conversation. So there'd be talking to someone who you sort of has suicidal thoughts as part of their, as part of the sort of where they are at the moment. And then there's a different conversation, which is finding out someone, how you're talking to someone who you don't think is particularly distressed. And I'll use an example of this. Happens to me, and I've talked to so many different men in different situations. Maybe something has happened to them, they're in process of divorce or something, and they say, no, I'm fine, I'm absolutely fine. And then you get to the point, I suppose this comes back to Alice's discussion of structure, the importance of the technique, is you get back to the part of your mental state examination that you have in your mind, where you have the question, where you ask, you know, have you ever thought that life isn't worth living? Or have you ever thought of taking your life or dying? You know, whatever the words you want to use. And I have found it so often that men in particular who've gone absolutely fine, I'm absolutely fine, when you ask that particular question, will burst into tears. And you could see that, or pause for a long time, because there's something about the truthfulness of it. Are they going to lie or tell you the truth? And you can see the sort of decision-making process. Okay, I'm going to tell the truth. And it's only through that question you can get to the level of distress and the truth of some sort of level of distress if someone is defending themselves and trying to hide something not consciously from you. So I think there is three different types of experiences. Because I think the way we can talk about it, it's as though there is one conversation in one setting with one experience, and actually there isn't, but there is something about the importance of talking about the crux of it. Have you ever thought that life isn't worth living? You know, where are you with that? However you want to phrase, and most clinicians I know have a particular way that they would ask the particular question. Everybody has it in a different way. So I was, you know, thinking about those different settings, I was thinking what I would tend to do with, when you were saying, where would you start the conversation? If I have enough time with somebody, I will say, where would you like to start? And then see where they want to start, because often that tells you an awful lot.
Thank you. And Alice, I wonder if we can come to you.
Yes, and I think we have to, you know, following on from Rachel's comments, the majority of people who die by suicide had not disclosed suicidal thoughts at their last clinical encounter. And there will be, and obviously we don't know the reality of exactly what happened at that last clinical encounter, but we know from the National Confidential Inquiry that not everybody who died by suicide had a detailed mental state examination. And there was a paper that they published in 2013-14 where they cover the mental state, their view of risk assessment. But I think the thing is, you just cannot assume. You have to ask. But it's actually, you don't just have to ask, you have to ask in a way that enables an honest disclosure. But also the clinician has to be present and sensitively attentive to what their patient tells them, because for a whole host of reasons, patients may not feel able to disclose. And we covered that at the start. It could be shame, embarrassment, fear. It's not that they're trying to deceive us. Genuinely, it's hard to talk about. So we have to be able to have the skills and the confidence to say, oh, I noticed perhaps you delayed a bit there, and maybe things not quite as okay as they might be. Or, you have to ask in a really sensitive to enable disclosure, and to understand why they may be fearful. They may be worried that someone's going to take their children away, that the mental health act may be used. There's so many different reasons that there needs to be a way where we get alongside people so that we collaboratively move forward, but at the pace of the patient. It's not up to, and this is the challenge we have, because we don't have open-ended appointment times. We don't have as much as we want to give. And I hope that's where some of the technical aspects come in, because hopefully we will have learnt techniques to guide the conversation where the person in distress doesn't feel invalidated or minimized, and also what they're telling us may be really important, but we just haven't allowed them to finish their sentence. And I don't think we're honest enough about some of the nuts and bolts of the challenges. But then that's another reason why, as we've all said, you have to take everybody seriously. And in a way, there's no such thing as low risk, because you don't know what will happen the minute they leave your room. They could get a brand new life event, an exacerbation of their mental illness if they have one. And this is why, maybe later on in the conversation, we'll be talking more about actually what practically we can do, given the challenges that we have, that it is not an exact science.
Yeah, let's move into that bit of the conversation now, I think, Alice. So we've talked about risk, and we've alluded to risk assessment, but we haven't really talked about risk assessment, and particularly the way that risk assessment is sometimes done with particular forms or set questions. Now that plays a part in the conversation. So I'm interested to in your views really on what part that plays in the conversation, usefully or unusefully, and how it can help or not to have the conversation. Perhaps Rachel, if we start with you.
Well, I was thinking of maybe we should think about both risk assessment and safety planning, the two different forms that come in. One I'm not sure we're honest about, which is risk assessment forms. And I'm thinking about risk assessment forms, not clinical risk assessment, but risk assessment forms. I think the evidence is that they're not good predictors of future risk. But then I think there's a question of who are they a risk assessment for? I tend to think that they're a risk assessment for the clinician. The clinician thinks, if I fill this form in, I'll be safe if something happens, but it's not really for the patient that they're working with, the risk assessment form. Whereas I think a safety plan is different. So a safety plan is a collaborative piece of work that you can do together, thinking about which it's sort of a production. I think Alice will be able to talk about safety planning very well, so I might hand over to Alice to talk about safety planning. But it's to do, there's something, the work with safety planning, again, different to a crisis plan, is thinking about collaboration and you can't, as a clinician, take responsibility for somebody else's actions, but you can use your skills and experience to help work with them to think about what will be helpful, what they can rely on, what the resources they have, because resources have come up as a very important area through this whole discussion. What actual resources someone has when they are feeling desperate or in crisis themselves, that they can lean on and rely on in that situation. So I think there's something very much about helping the person in front of you think about the resources that they really have, and they can the next time they're in crisis. But I might hand over to Alice, because I think, Alice, when it comes to safety planning, I think you're very good at talking about it.
Well, put simply, it is a co-produced and agreed set of strategies, people to contact for social, emotional, psychological support, more specialist support, maybe such as some of the specialist helplines and websites, but also professional support, that person, so they know exactly what they can do to help themselves if their suicidal thoughts return or their thoughts of self-harm, because the reality is most people do not know how to navigate the healthcare system. You know, quite often you tell people they may do a couple of things on their crisis plan, and a large part is ring 999 or go to the emergency department. But then, of course, they turn up to the emergency department and people are fed up with them that they keep turning up. But of course, that's what we've told them to do. So we don't always, not always, routinely think about working with that person for them to identify the things that they know help them. We are all individuals, and it's one of these things that nobody can make your safety plan for you. It's your safety plan. You don't even need to be an expert to make one. You can make one on your own. But sometimes we see people in distress, and especially if they're not familiar with the format, they may not know where to start. The other thing is, one of the strongest evidence we have in terms of suicide prevention is removal of access to means. And there's so much research on this now on a public health level. But we don't routinely work with our patients to remove, reduce, or mitigate their access to means on a personal level. And again, you can take this research at a population level and say, what can we make it count for this person in distress for this period of time? Mary, I see you want to speak, so I'd like to hand over to you and give way to you, obviously, as the patient's voice. Thank you.
I think I put my hand up, Alice, because I wasn't sure I could agree with you on that particular thing. I agree with you about safety plans, and it is my safety plan, not your safety plan. And it is, in a way, it seems to me the beauty of safety plans is they are like very tiny stepping stones across a raging river. So I think talking in terms of safety is so much better than talking in terms of risk from the recipient perspective. But I think detailed plans, and I have always had and probably always will have a very detailed plan. I know exactly how and where I would die should I choose to do that. As access to means, I have a house full of access to means, still not so acutely in my wilderness time, most of the time. And for me, that has always been a sort of talisman of good fortune. And that I'm perhaps not helpful in saying that, I might be unusual, but my means have been my comfort blanket, not my risk, I think, for me personally. And that may run counter to the literature, and we can edit it out if it's not a helpful contribution, I know.
Yes, Mary, I'm so sorry to say this, but that really runs counter to the literature, but that is so complex.
Slip to, sorry.
No, a couple of points there, really. I think the first thing about Alice's point about access to means, I think there is something about it's important to have that in the public domain for two reasons. You know, we talk about there being focal points of increased suicide taking place in an area, and then you immediately try to solve that, or try to help put more measures of support in those focal points, whether it's a railway station or a bridge or whatever. So I think it kind of alludes to that point. I think, Alice, what I'm trying to say is the access to means also includes that. Can I just pedal back a bit to the risk assessment? I know we've moved on and we're talking about safety plan and crisis plan. I mean, the risk assessment, Tom, is something, as we said, we do it day in, day out, and we know how unreliable or poor a predictor it is. But the fact remains, we do it. And it's important thing is, how do we get it right? How do we do it properly? And for me, something that I do in my risk assessments is to be constantly mindful that risk is dynamic, risk is changeable. So, I might see somebody and they're not at the kind of low risk, or not saying that they're at risk, but it's important to be mindful that the risk can change and things can get worse immediately. Like Alice said, they might leave the room and something might happen. And it's those reasons that the risk changes, those factors that causes the risk change is important, because that can then feed into the crisis plan and safety plan. So you can then tie it all together in that context. And the other thing, can I just mention, with risk assessment, as I said, everybody does it, colleagues at all professional levels, at all grades do it. But when you do it, it's important, whoever the individual is, that they go and get some support, whether it's supervision as a junior doctor, or where you talk to your team leader or to your CMHT or to your ward staff. So it's important people go and discuss or have some kind of peer supervision, or to share the risk, to talk it over and see if we can contain it and provide a safer place for the individual. Otherwise, what happens is the individual just keeps holding the risk, and if something goes wrong, it becomes their kind of thing that they struggle with. So I think from my perspective, with risk assessment, it's important we talk it over with individuals. So I know I've kind of pedaled back a bit and gone back to risk assessment and not moved ahead with what we were talking, but I just thought it was important to mention.
I was wanting to come back in again just about risk assessment. There's something, I suppose, again, about the sort of mindless doing of risk assessment and using it as part of as a structure for your own clinical risk assessment. That's a sort of different of how you use it. But I was also wanting to come back with the discussion between Alice and Mary, thinking again, I think this is very important. This is hopefully what I was hoping with these discussions, that actually the real dilemma, and this is the real sort of safety planning dilemma that sort of came live into the group, because I was thinking, I've been in that role of the clinician thinking, look, I know, the evidence is this. And the person I'm talking to is saying, no, actually, back off. This is the way I manage things. This is what I'm telling you, and how you have to work with that and have that sort of discussion between the two of you and maybe agree to differ. That is okay.
Can I just say, and I think also this is the whole thing why safety plan has to be person-centered. So the clinician needs to negotiate with the patient about how far they feel able to make their home safer at the moment. So this is where you have to have the idea where we're very diligent. If you cannot remove a risk, can you reduce it? If you cannot reduce it, well, can you mitigate it? Can you mitigate it by the person agreeing that they will they will make a safety plan which suits them? And I know that Mary and I have discussed this before, for some people, the key part of their safety plan might be a special poem. For other people, it might be exercise. For other people, it may be a cognitive task that they know they just have to ride the storm of their suicidal thoughts, head down, get on with it, and literally just distract themselves. It's very easy to be judgmental about a safety plan that we would write for ourselves. Not everyone loves a poem. Not everyone loves watching YouTube videos of silly animals. The whole thing is what the person chooses. So it has to be patient-led. And also by making it collaborative and patient-led, you then, it gets tweaked. It's a living document. It's the same thing with a risk assessment. A risk assessment is valid for when you are in the room. A safety plan that the person has made in good faith with you compassionately almost as their coach. You know, we're a coach in the corner. Patients at 3 a.m., what is going to stop them acting on their suicidal thoughts? Let's think about that.
Yeah.
Just wondering whether it comes back also to the question that's underlying, I think, this whole conversation, which is it our job to try and stop someone doing something, or is it our job to have a therapeutic engagement? And how we sort of shift that focus, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think, so I was going to say something similar to what you did just previously, Rachel, about the, this is the crux of it, isn't it? If it's a person-centered safety plan that maybe doesn't fit with what the literature says, that's the part of the difficulty of the conversation. But it struck me that something we talked about earlier is really important in that conversation, which is honesty and openness. And I think the honesty for the clinician to be able to say, well, actually, the evidence suggests this isn't the safest thing. And then for the patient to be able to say, well, I understand that, or okay. But for me, I think this, and for that to be an honest and real conversation that gets to whatever point it gets to, and that's unique to that situation. But it strikes me that's the honesty is really kind of important. Just the key thing underlying that conversation for both people to say, and that a therapeutic conversation doesn't mean that it isn't one, that it's one without any challenge, because there's a bit of challenge in that, isn't there? And I think what we're saying is that's okay if it's done in a honest and compassionate way to get to a shared aim of trying to, we're talking about creating a safety plan here. See, I don't know, Mary, I wonder if we could just come back to you to respond to this conversation, I suppose, that we were talking about.
I think it is really important to be able to talk honestly in this way, and it's obviously a privilege that we are doing it, and hopefully in the most constructive and helpful way possible. I think where this sits is almost with what Rachel is asking, like, whose risk is it anyway? Ultimately, the risk belongs to the person whose life may be at risk, and then I think in that co-crafting of a safety plan, what you don't want to do is rob them of choice or freedom or what might be to them a sort of security. And I was wondering, it has been said to me before in a coercive sort of way, we are going to have to send somebody into the house, Mary, to get rid of everything for you before we can send you home. I never found that helpful when I had lost lots of freedoms, and the freedom to live perhaps not quite by the book in terms of risk seems one of the freedoms that I and others may want to hold on to. And I think if not being able to be truthful because of fear of the consequences is more harmful than being truthful and sharing the consequences together, I think that's my sense of it. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. So it's been the time has flown by in this discussion, and I feel we're getting under the skin of parts of it. We could talk for longer, but I wondered if before we finished, I wondered if I'll give each person on the panel the chance to just kind of reflect on the conversation and say what you think the key kind of takeaways are, the key things that have resonated with you maybe in the conversation. We'll just take it in turns to do that. So perhaps Sudipto, if we can start with you, please.
Tom, thank you for that. It's really been an inspiring and invigorating talk conversation today, and I think it's such an important aspect of our clinical roles and for our patients and individuals we have regular contact with. I mean, from my perspective, I think it's things that stays in my mind is the fact that it is about the individual we are talking to. We need to be honest and compassionate about what they're going through, but at the same time, be aware that we are clinicians and we have to do a proper clinical assessment, stroke review, and then come up with a management plan. Now, that management plan, it could be the crisis plan, it could be the safety plan. I think you can't really separate. I think you need both of them really, but it has to be co-produced. It has to be with the individual that you're seeing and helping. But the other thing that also sticks in my mind is the support. You need support for the clinician doing the assessment, and suicide assessment is a tricky conversation, but they need support, they need supervision, they need to be sure that they are not just left holding the whole situation by themselves, and there are other people they can talk to, whether it's to just come up with a management safety plan, or even with otherwise when they feel that they've had a difficult conversation. But it's been really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really important points. Alice, if I go to you next, please.
Thank you. I think I'd like to finish off by just emphasising that this is one part of our professional life where we need compassion and clinical diligence in equal measures. So, for example, you have to have that compassionate connection so that people can disclose how they're really feeling, but also we need to bring our professional knowledge, our technical skills, and a plea really that instead of just seeing it like a sort of suicide risk assessment, we see it as an assessment of the person in distress and potentially considering suicide. And actually, we need to assess to understand, to validate, but also to intervene. So we don't assess to give them, a risk number or decide if they're high or low. We assess to intervene and do something practical about it. And there are things that we do as a clinician or services do, but actually one of the most important things is that we engage with this person and help them find ways where actually they no longer want to end their life. So they don't want to end their life today, this week, this month, and we have to do that together. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Rachel, if I could ask you to do the same, please.
I'll be very quick. I'll just say, look, this conversation, having this opportunity to have this conversation with someone as a psychiatrist, it's a privilege and opportunity. It's the heart of why we're doing psychiatry. So there's something about embracing it. And of course it is frightening on one level, but fear is the heart of it anyway.
Thank you. And Mary, we started with you. I'm going to finish with you as well.
Well, I think it's been a real privilege to be part of this conversation because it is encouraging, inspiring, thought-provoking and powerful, and hopefully hugely important. And I think my thought is that there are at least two vulnerable people in these encounters, and that unless there is a cared for, supported clinician, they cannot offer the sort of care that they might want to. So that dynamic is really at the very heart of this, that people who aren't cared for in their professional roles can't provide the very best care to the people who need it. But more, I'm inspired by the honesty and openness of this conversation. And thank everyone for their contributions and for letting me to be part of it.
Thank you, Mary. So I just want to thank everyone, Rachel, Alice, Sudipto, and Mary. It's been a really fascinating, educational, and also moving conversation for me. And I don't underestimate how much we all give of ourselves to have this conversation. I think we all get something out of it, but I hope we do it in the service of the people watching. So I hope that, well, I'm sure that lots of people will get a lot out of this conversation. But I just want to thank you for the kind of emotional labor of being part of it. That's for everyone involved. And thank you once again to Rachel for bringing us together and being the kind of driving force for all of these conversations that we've had. So that concludes this conversation.